All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to Risk Factors for Youth Substance Misuse with Chris Gabrielson. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes PTTC under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. The PTTC believes that words matter and uses affirming language in all activities. We have a few housekeeping items. If you have technical issues, please individually message Rebecca Buller, Jen Winslow, or Alyssa Koala in the chat section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to assist you. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar near the bottom of your screen to enable by going into the More section, select Captions, and Show Captions. Questions for our speaker should be put in the Q&A section, also at the bottom of the screen. And we want to emphasize this today because we do expect a large group, and we don't want to miss any questions as the chat rolls by. You will be directed to a short survey link after this session, and we would appreciate it if you could fill it out. It only takes about 3 minutes, and it helps us report to our funders and continue to present webinars like this one. And certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all those who have attended the webinar in full. It can take up to 2 weeks for those to arrive. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing or information on upcoming events, please see our social media pages. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Chris Gabrielson is the co-director of the Great Lakes Prevention Technology Transfer Center. She has worked in substance misuse prevention field for over 30 years. Chris was the Associate Director of the Western Center for the Application of Prevention Technologies, co-authored the first substance abuse prevention specialist training curriculum, and co-authored the textbook Substance Abuse Prevention, the Intersection of Science and Practice. As a consultant, she has worked with states and communities around the nation to bridge the gap between research and practice, assisting prevention professionals in maximizing their effectiveness. And I want to go ahead and turn things over to Chris now.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. So great to have you here. As Rebecca mentioned, we have a large group today, which is fantastic. So pleased that you all are interested in learning more about this topic. So before we get too deep into this, though, we're really curious to know, because we've gotten such a large group, how did you hear about this webinar? Rebecca's going to post a poll and for us to see. And hopefully it's showing up. We added it last minute, so. All right. I'm not seeing it. Oh, there we go. There it is. So just curious, how did you hear about this webinar? And if it's not one of those that are options there, you can go to click other and then fill that in at the bottom. Let's just do that real quickly. All right, it looks like our email. So if you aren't on our email list, every Friday we send out an update on different training opportunities that are available through us. So be sure to check that out if you aren't already on our email. All right, so Rebecca, if you want to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So it looks like for those of you who are curious to know, it looks like about half of you learned about it through our email. So that's great for us to know, just what works to get out the word to you all. All right, we'll go ahead and stop sharing and we'll move along with our webinar. All right, so our path for today, what are we going to do? What are we going to cover? I'm going to first talk about risk factors in general, kind of an overview and introduction into risk factors. Then we're going to take a deep dive into risk factors and really look at each risk factor of this set of risk factors that I'm going to use for today to make sure you have a clear understanding of what each risk factor is. And then we're going to move into how do we put this information into action? How do we address risk factors within our communities? Want to make sure you all have seen the risk factors for youth substance misuse participant workbook. This is on our website. You were sent an email as long as you signed up by a certain point yesterday afternoon. I think there's about 25 of you who signed up after we had sent out the email. But Jen also put in the chat a link to the website page where you can download this workbook either as a PDF or you can look at it as a flipbook online. And the PowerPoint slides are also there, so you can download the PowerPoint slides there. A recording of this webinar will be posted on that same page once it's processed and this is completed. All right, so let's move into an introduction to risk factors. What I want to make sure, though, that we have that I establish is a common understanding when I'm talking about prevention today, which definition I'm using. Because when the word prevention is said amongst our field in terms of all the different folks working across the prevention, treatment, recovery, and other fields such as social work, etc., prevention can be used in different ways. So what I'm talking about today is primary prevention. And let's look at some examples of primary prevention in other areas so that we can hopefully have a clear understanding. So on our computers we're all using right now, most of us, hopefully all of us, have antivirus software on our computers, and that prevents viruses from getting into our computer. So prevents it from ever happening. It's not that once we get a virus, it takes care of it. It's preventing it from happening. Lighthouses shine their light so that ships don't crash onto the shore. They're preventing shipwrecks from ever happening. They're not taking care of the ships after they've crashed. They're preventing it. Similarly, sunscreen prevents sunburns, and immunizations prevent illnesses. So the context for today, when we're looking at risk factors, talking about risk factors, is how do we prevent things from ever occurring? Not taking care, not that we don't need that other part in terms of taking care of things once that it's happened, but this is the part of the continuum that we are going to be talking about today. All right, if you would like a definition, if you're a definition kind of person, I know I am. Is one definition of prevention. It's the proactive process of empowering individuals and systems to meet the challenges of life events and transitions by creating and reinforcing conditions that promote healthy behaviors and lifestyles. So when we're talking about risk factors, as well as protective factors, hopefully you all join me, or many of you joined me in December for the protective factors webinar. We're really looking at how do we reduce risk factors in order to create and reinforce conditions that promote healthy behaviors and lifestyles. All right, well, that's all good and fine, but what do we do and how do we do it? We do our work in prevention where we do our needs assessment of what's going on in our communities, what challenges are we having in our communities. It may be that we're having problems with underage youth vaping. It could be adult binge drinking. It could be, any number of things that we will identify through our needs assessment. But the question is, what do we do about it and how do we address it? What often happens at this stage is somebody throws out, well, I've heard of such and such a program that is great, and I know it was really successful in another community, we should just do that. Or, things that don't necessarily follow a linear fashion in terms of how to address those problems. And that can be because people are missing that component of risk and protective factors in their planning. So we have information about what a problem is around substance misuse problem within our community. So let's say that it is underage drinking. We find out that there's a significant rate and the rate's increasing in our community of underage drinking. Well, just knowing that doesn't give us any information on what to do about it. But if we examine what risk factors are prevalent within our community, that provides us the map to get there. So this key of risk and protective factors, but we're going to focus on the risk factors today, is that gives us the information of what kind of strategies, activities, programs that we want to implement, prevention programs, in order to address the challenges within our community, the priority problems. I wanted to just throw this in here that prevention gets only about 4% of federal drug demand reduction funding. Very, very small amount. In the context of everything, we get a very small amount. So we need to be sure that we are using our dollars wisely. We're using them truly for primary prevention, because otherwise it's not going to happen if we don't use our funds for it, right? And we want to squeeze out every possible effectiveness we can out of these dollars. And we can do that by ensuring that we identify the priority problems within our community, and then we identify those priority risk factors within our community and work on reducing those. So that's kind of the context in which I wanted to make sure you had that idea as we're progressing through this webinar. All right, so how do we maximize our effectiveness? We maximize our effectiveness by reducing risk factors that increase the likelihood of substance misuse, and we increase the protective factors. By reducing risk factors and increasing protective factors, as I said with that definition, when we were talking about the definition of prevention, we are creating and reinforcing conditions that promote healthy behaviors and lifestyles. So just remind folks that that's where we're at with this. All right, and with that being said, a poll is going to go up here, but before you put up the poll, just hold on 1 second. Rebecca, I think, is going to put it up here. Please only complete this quiz, this pre-test quiz, if you are going to be staying on for the entire webinar. If you need to log off early, if you can hold off, and you can just jot notes maybe for yourself of what your answers are. But please just complete it if you're going to be here for the post-test towards the end of the webinar. This is information for me to tell me how well I did in terms of presenting this information to you. So don't feel like it's a quiz of you personally. It's more for us to see how well this webinar worked to get the information across. All right, and with that, Rebecca, if you could go ahead and post the poll.
Chris, while while people are doing that pre-test, could you please give the reference for the prevention definition quote? A couple people are asking and they want to cite it.
I will double check on that. I don't have that off the top of my head. It's been one that's been posted so many times, sometimes that we lose the original source, but I will do my best to find that, and we'll put that in the follow-up email. And be sure to scroll down in this poll. There are 4 questions, so keep scrolling down. All right, and I see about 55% have completed, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to leave the poll up so people can finish up the questions, and I'm going to go ahead and cover a couple more points as people are finishing it. All right, so definition of risk factors is simply they are the factors that increase the likelihood of substance misuse occurring. And I have an intro video that I want to share with you. It's from the Communities That Care, and they do talk about Communities That Care in here, but it can also be applied, the information in here can be applied to the Strategic Prevention Framework, or SPIF, that many preventionists use. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to that.
If you want to prevent a health and behavior problem before it happens, you need to know about the risk factors that predict the problem. What kinds of problems? Well, if a dad asks his son to grab him a beer from the fridge, it's more likely that that boy would be drinking before it's legal age. If a girl hangs out with friends who are using marijuana, she's more likely to use marijuana later. We call those things risk factors. A risk factor is a condition that increases the likelihood of problem behaviors. Understanding risk factors is one of the key foundations of the communities that care process. How do we know about risk factors and where did they come from? Well, we've looked at hundreds of studies across 30 years. We've looked for consistency of risk factors in at least 2 well-documented, well-designed studies that follow young people across development. What did we learn from these hundreds of studies? Well, the first thing we learned is pretty much common sense. We learned that children are influenced by every domain they grow up in. They're influenced by the community, the school they go to, their family, and within the individual and their friends. And why is this important to communities that care process? Well, it's important because we know that in order to be effective, you have to look across all 4 of these domains. And you do this in order to see where these risk factors are affecting most of the kids in the community, and that's where you want to intervene. The second thing we've learned is that risk factors can be present across development, from prenatal through high school. Kids who are aggressive in 1st and 2nd grade, for example, are more likely to be violent later in life. Or kids who don't have the skills to refuse drug offers in middle school are more likely to get involved in drug use. Why is this important? Because you want to provide preventive interventions across the developmental span. The third thing we've learned is that risk factors predict multiple problems. For example, kids who have low commitment to school and don't value education, they're more likely to be involved in substance abuse, delinquency, violence, teen pregnancy, and dropping out of school. Another example is high family conflict. Now, we all have some conflict in our families, but in families where there's high levels of family conflict, those kids are at risk for a broad range of problem behaviors, including violence, delinquency, school dropout, teen pregnancy, substance abuse, and even depression and anxiety. Why is this important? Well, you get more bang for your buck when you're addressing those risk factors. You can impact not one, but many health and behavior outcomes and really change your community. The fourth thing we've learned is that risk and protective factors operate in a similar way across racial groups and regions of the country. The risk factors are related to health and behavior problems in a very similar way. For example, if you have high family conflict in a Latino urban family, that predicts health and behavior problems. Or if you're a white kid living on a farm in a rural area in a family with high levels of family conflict, that predicts health and behavior problems. So high levels of family conflict is a risk factor, whoever and wherever you are. Why is this important? It means that the science of prevention applies to your community. Now, you may be thinking, the situation in my community is unique. And it is. And this is the reason that communities that care is important. It helps you understand the actual levels of risk exposure to these factors that are unique to your community. Now, before I leave the topic of risk factors, I want to talk about the other side of the coin, protective factors.
All right, and we're going to go ahead and stop there. Again, as I mentioned before, we did a training on protective factors in December. If you didn't watch it, be sure to watch the recording so you can get that half of the picture. All right, so the reason why I chose that video was because for today, we are using the list of risk and protective factors from the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington. That was created by Doctors Rico Catalano and David Hawkins. Kevin Haggerty, who was on that video, also works for Social Development Research Group and was the director there for many years. So this is the information or I should say the list that was put together by Social Development Research Group in your participant workbook on page 7. This table is on there, so you can refer to it throughout this training and after. Want to make sure a couple points with this list. We'll talk about it for a few different slides here, but there's a misconception I've heard and even seen written that Doctors Hawkins and Catalano did the research to come up with this list. But just to point out that although they've done research on many things, what was done to create this list was a literature review. So they went through and looked at all the research that was done in these areas. So they didn't actually conduct the research themselves. But as Kevin mentioned in the video, for inclusion of a risk factor on their list, it had to be shown in multiple studies, not just one study saying this was a risk factor for substance misuse or the other areas. And the studies had to be longitudinal and predictive, meaning they started with a group of kids who weren't already using or who hadn't already gone through treatment, but looking at primary prevention, so looking at a group of kids, following them along to see what happens in their lives, to see whether or not they started misusing substances. So it's longitudinal and predictive is what we're looking for in the research there. So to be on this list of risk factors has to be in multiple studies, and the studies had to be longitudinal and predictive in nature. This is important because we can feel much more secure that these truly are risk factors. They aren't just something that maybe showed up in one study, but it really wasn't quite accurately captured, but we can feel very confident in this list. And that's why I like to use this list. I highly recommend that if you have another list that you use through your prevention program, that you figure out what the criteria was for inclusion on that list. So be sure to take a good look and make sure it's evidence-based in terms of a research-based list of risk factors. All right, couple things to keep in mind. Risk factors are not causal, meaning if a risk factor is in your life, you are doomed to substance misuse. Not causal. It's that increases the likelihood. Risk factors, as Kevin said, exist in multiple contexts. They exist within our communities, our schools, amongst individuals and peers. So they are cross contexts. And the last thing is, a key point, is the impact of risk factors is exponential. So typically, if, for example, one risk factor exists in a youth's life, except for there's one exception, I'll share that in a minute, but typically if there's just one risk factor, it's not going to have an impact on that child or that youth. If there's two risk factors, there's going to be a little bit more likelihood. If there's four risk factors, all of a sudden, the likelihood of substance misuse is increasing exponentially. So that's where we want to keep things as low as possible in terms of risk factors in our youth's lives and our communities. All right, couple things with this list. And again, this is on page 7 of your workbook. You'll see at the top, it has these 6 different problem behavior areas or challenges. So this list is not just for substance misuse, but it's for delinquency, teenage pregnancy, school dropout, violence, and depression and anxiety. And what you'll see is down below here, for example, with family management problems, they found in studies, so multiple longitudinal predictive studies, that family management problems have an impact and increase the likelihood in all these 6 areas. While on the other hand, availability of drugs is shown through research to increase the likelihood of substance misuse and violence. So there are missing dots in this, and the missing dots don't necessarily mean that they are not risk factors for that area. In many cases, it's likely because the research hasn't been done in that area. So don't put a lot of weight on the missing dots, although it is important to know that research has not shown that to be a risk factor for that area at this time. All right. So I'm going to throw in a few pop quizzes for you all to keep you hopefully get your neurons firing here. So we have a poll that's going to pop up here, and I want to see how well I did at this. What do you think? Risk factors do what? And I'm going to have 4 of these pop quizzes, so be ready to jump in here when they come up. All right, about 10 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and share the results. And well done. 88% of you have the correct answer. So the risk factors increase the likelihood of drug use or substance misuse. I see that 7% said that they're causally related, and I just want to reinforce that they are not causally related. That just because a risk factor is in a child's life does not doom them to misuse substances. Yeah, so it's not that link where that cause and effect link. It increases the likelihood, but it's not causally related. All right, we can go ahead and stop sharing. Well done. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move into the next section. All right, this is where we're going to get into the deep dive into each risk factors. Some of you might be like, oh, really? She's going to go one by one by one. Yes, I am. And I'm going to tell you why. Because what I've seen is there's often misunderstandings about what the risk factors mean. And you need to have an understanding of what these risk factors are in order to do your planning around them. If you don't understand what the definitions are, what's behind the definition, what it really looks like, you won't be able to effectively plan. So let's go ahead and do that. And I see some thumbs up with that you all are here with me. So that's great. Feel free to use those reactions. I know we have 520 people at this point on here. So my ability to read the chat is going to be really minimal, but I do see the reactions going up. So thank you. Thank you for doing that. All right, let's jump into this first domain then, the community risk factors. All right, and people are showing me some love. I love that. Thank you. All right, availability of drugs. There are 2 things we need to think about with availability. And one is that the more available substances are, so we're talking about alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, inhalants, etc. The more available they are, the more likely that they're going to be used. So we've seen that research study after research study after research study. No surprise there, I'm sure, to any of you all. But an interesting piece is also just the perception of the availability increases use. So if kids think something's more readily available to them, they're going to be more likely to use. So in some cases, changing the perception is going to be much easier than changing the actual physical availability. So again, something to think about as we are planning our prevention programming is there a situation where you have high availability within your community, perhaps you can work on changing perceptions. Or in some cases, there may not be great availability, but just kids think that they're readily available, which is increasing the use. So correcting that perception would be, of course, important in that situation as well. So there are 2 types of availability. One is social availability. So that's getting alcohol, tobacco, other drugs from friends and family. And the other is retail availability. So from stores, bars, etc. So when we're looking at planning our prevention programs, and if you see in your community that there's the risk factor is very prevalent and of availability of drugs in your community, you will need to take a further step to determine whether it's social availability or retail availability is the most prevalent within your community. All right, community laws and norms favorable towards drug use. So there's a few things to unpack with this one. One is we're talking about both laws and norms. So the community norms, as you all probably know, impact our use. So if the norm is that it's okay, for the weekends, it's a time to drink a lot and have fun by drinking, etc. Or if it's a very sports-oriented community where they do tailgating and the drinking is the focal point, those kind of things, those community norms, that's, again, if their community norms are favorable towards use, there's going to be more use. The laws reflect our norms because whatever is acceptable within our community, and that's where we put our emphasis and what's important to us, that's what's going to often is emphasized within our laws. And our laws, our policies have a great impact on the levels of use. So for some examples of laws that have been well studied, researched over and over and over again, are things like tax rates. If we increase the cost of alcohol, for example, and tobacco, as we increase those costs, we see decreased use. So tax rates have a great impact on the levels of use. Things like, of course, changing the drinking age to 21 years of age. We saw a great impact in terms of reducing the amount of alcohol use, as well as other things like the traffic accidents that were alcohol related. Tobacco-free restaurants in different areas impacted use. So again, these are examples of laws that we can put into place that can impact use. So as I was putting together this PowerPoint slides, finalizing it, I went to my local grocery store and I came out in the parking lot, and right near me was parked this van. Drive me to drink wine. So I live in an area with a lot of wineries. And I found it fascinating as I think about community norms. What kind of community norms are reflected in this message on the van? I'm curious, put it in the chat. What do you think is being reflected here with drive me to drink wine? What kind of community norms are being reflected? Well, drinking and driving, they are saying they will drive you so that you won't be drinking, but yeah, more that it's okay to drink. Wine doesn't hurt you. Drinking to excess is acceptable. Yeah, so absolutely. Think of all the community norms that are tied up in this one statement on this van driving around our area. And I encourage you, the next time you go out, just start looking around your community. Many of you probably already do this, but what norms are being displayed throughout your community, throughout your social media posts, through your newspapers, of what's included in your newspapers? Again, because I'm in a big winery area, I opened up my local newspaper the other day, and there was a whole page on the wine industry and beer, and I mean, it was like the entire page was filled with stories about the industry. And so it's, again, what are the community norms around that? All right, let's make one more point about community laws and norms. Our social norms are reflected in our laws. So if we're looking to change our laws, many times we're going to have to look at impacting our norms. So again, thinking about our prevention strategies, if we're wanting to put new laws into place, we may need to work on some of our norms before we can get those laws passed, our policies passed. In some cases, you can do it that one way, but then, in terms of passing the law and impacting social norms, but that can be more challenging to do. Another way our norms are often reflected are through media portrayals of drug use. So the norms, I want to read this because I want to say it right too, that I love this statement. It says, consistent evidence that youth and young adults are highly exposed to substance use portrayals. There is consistent evidence that our youth are exposed to portrayals of substance use, and these portrayals are associated with subsequent use. So our kids are seeing a lot of this through social media, through movies, through television, through YouTube videos, et cetera, et cetera. And we do know through research that the more they are exposed to this, that there's the increase in use. And I have a video here from the Truth Initiative that I want to share with you that speaks to the tobacco piece. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over here.
Must you really smoke?
I love it so very much.
It's shockingly effective!
sucks.
Got an extra cigarette?
Who got a cigarette in here? Anyone got a cigarette I can borrow?
All right. Have any of you seen that video before? Thumbs up with a reaction. I'm curious if any of you have seen that before. See some thumbs up. Yeah, I think it's really well done. And I saw a question in the chat of where's the link? Could we get a link to the video? And I know it was put in here, but I just wanted to point out that in your participant workbook, there are links to the videos that I've shown in the in this presentation. So you can go back to there and get access to the videos that way as well. And I know we have a few questions in Q&A, so let me quickly take a few of those. One with Rebecca, availability. Why is the popular opinion then that prohibition was a failure? That's a great question and can take a while to answer, but you have to look between availability and community norms and the interaction between those. But also, a lot of people talk about the prohibition being a failure, and in some studies of looking back at it, it actually was very successful in terms of reducing use. So if you're looking at the decrease in availability, decrease in use, it actually did that. Did it wipe out it all? No, but it did do something. And would a drug dealer, not a friend or family member, be considered retail or still a social source? That's a great question, Sarah. And you know what? I have not I've not seen an answer about that. So great question. I'm guessing it would fall under retail because they're still purchasing it. They aren't being given by a friend or family member, but not positive what the research scientists would say about that. And somebody says, with drugs and alcohol being delivered and ordered online, shouldn't we all have availability as a risk factor? Great point. Boy, did the pandemic change that, right? Increasing availability skyrocketed with during the pandemic in many communities, not all communities, but many communities. So I would say availability, it depends on your, if those laws change within your community, then you're that's likely a good statement in terms of that it would be prevalent as a risk factor in your community. Last one, I understand changing perceptions of availability of drugs are not actually readily available in your community, but how do we change perceptions of availability of substances are readily available in our community without destroying trust? Ah, great question. I like that. So that I really like what you're thinking, because we don't want to destroy that trust. If there is such a significant availability that kids would see it regardless, then I think you're absolutely right. You would need to actually reduce that physical availability. In many cases, when you know what the actual physical availability is, and you do a survey to find out what the perception of availability is, it's often much higher than the actual availability. So that's where changing that would not impact that trust. But I think that's a fantastic point, that you don't want to destroy that trust. All right, with that, let's jump back in, because I want to make sure I cover everything. Transitions and mobility is another community risk factor, and I wanted to make sure that you understand there's two parts to this. You'll see the picture of a school at top, not a school that I ever attended. Our schools didn't look like that, but I couldn't find a good picture that looked like a school I attended. But with transitions, we're talking about transitions within school in terms of the typical scheduled transitions from elementary school to middle school and middle school to high school. And then we're also talking about unscheduled transitions where if families are moving around a lot, or a child is in foster care and gets moved around a lot, or the different reasons of why a child would be moved around to different schools. So both those types of transitions within schools increase the likelihood of substance misuse. Again, not just one risk factor doesn't typically impact a child, but if that risk factor along with other risk factors within a child's life can increase the risk of substance misuse. What do we do that with prevention in terms of, for example, those typical transitions? We can't avoid those typical transitions, make all schools K through 12, or we don't want to do that. But when we're thinking about our prevention programming and increasing protective factors, that can be an ideal time during those times of transitions, and making sure we're working to help kids successfully approach those transitions and go through those transitions. So not that we can avoid them completely, but what can we do to buffer their impact? Then the bottom picture, so we're talking about transitions and mobility. We're also talking about transitions within a community, either a lot of people moving into a community or moving out of a community, and or a community where there's a lot of commuting. Again, either a bunch of people commuting in or a lot of people commuting out of a community. So what happens with that is, as people are, for example, with the commuting piece, if you're in a suburb where a significant part of your population goes somewhere else for the day, you are missing all those people who would otherwise be engaged within your community for 10 hours in a day. So that's where that has that impact. And Cheryl, I happened to glance down at the chat. Military families move a lot. Absolutely. And we are going to talk about, we have a webinar in April on that. So I encourage you all to register for that and join in on that discussion. All right, low neighborhood attachment and community disorganization. Few things I want to talk about here. One is really important that I'm not talking about income levels. Research does not show that by the different communities by the impact, let me start over, the impact of, or the likelihood of low attachment and community disorganization is not related to income. So in terms of the different types of communities within a community, you can have high attachment in a low income community. You can have low attachment in a high income community. So there's often the assumption that this could be impacted by income levels, but that has not been shown through research to be true. So just want to put that out there. But the more attachment in the community that there is, that as problems arise, they're taken care of. The community is organized. So even something like vandalism, if there's a community with high attachment and high organization, vandalism happens, it's taken care of, covered up, etc., whatever. Not whatever, but it's taken care of, right? So another thing is, when there's high attachment and high organization, there's a lot more it's kind of that it takes a village to raise a child. And I know for myself, with thinking about my kids as they were growing up in our little community here, I'm in a smaller community. There were times when I would hear about my kids' behavior from somebody else. For example, one of my boys, when they were younger, were riding their bike without a helmet on, and this person knew that I required my boys to ride bikes with helmet on. So they come back, and I was like, "Huh? So I heard you weren't wearing your helmet." It was hanging off the handlebars, and they're like, "How did you know?" Like, how could you have heard? And it was great to be able to say, there are eyes all around this town watching you. And so as they grew up, things that they might have been inclined to get involved with, I think it really helped, because there was that attachment to the community in terms of, and the organization within the community, that we really work as a community here, and that makes a difference on the behaviors. All right. Last risk factor in the community domain. Extreme economic deprivation. This is another one that's interesting because often you will see poverty on lists of risk factors. However, the research is mixed in this area, as I say on this screen, that mixed research results regarding extreme poverty alone being a risk factor for substance misuse. So in and of itself, studies have shown both that it is a risk factor, it isn't a risk factor, and that's with substance misuse because thinking about those youth with a lot of extra money, thinking back to the availability, they have the money to pay for alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, etc. So this is one where it's usually that it needs to be related and tied into some other risk factors for it to actually have some impact. All right, pop quiz number 2. Are you ready to go? True or false? We've got a poll coming up here. Reducing the prevalence of community domain risk factors in your community can decrease the likelihood of youth substance misuse. True or false? Reducing the prevalence of community domain risk factors in your community can decrease the likelihood of youth substance misuse. All right, about 10 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. All right, 98% of you are correct. And it can be, sometimes you're like, well, if we're reducing risk factors within the community domain, how does that really impact the youth? Because you aren't directly working with the youth. But yes, indeed, by reducing those risk factors in the community domain, you are reducing the likelihood of youth substance use. Well done, everybody. Oops, I'm sorry, and I clicked the wrong thing. There we go. Hopefully I didn't mess that up, Rebecca. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move into the family domain. With the family domain, I was looking to see questions really fast, but I think I'm going to keep moving along here. All right, family history of drug use. Couple things going on with this as a risk factor. There's the genetics component, picture on the right, and the picture on the left. Hopefully you're getting what I'm trying to say, that it depends on what the fertile ground within which your family is developing, of what's going on within a community, excuse me, I gotta switch over to family. What's going on within a family can have an impact on drug use, in terms of drug use. Want to make sure, let me flip my notes to make sure I point out everything I want to point out. So with the genetic use, amazingly, 40 to 60% of a person's vulnerability is due to genetics or other biological factors. So that's a huge component of our vulnerability is tied up in the genetics and biological factors. But it's important to note, genes alone are not sufficient for substance misuse to occur. So just because you do have substance use disorders within your family, again, does not doom you to addiction. But it's increasing the likelihood, and that's where you want to reduce the other risk factors that are within a child's life as much as possible if you do have the genetics going on, the family history going on. With the fertile soil on the left-hand side, that piece of it, that is if a caregiver is actively using and modeling substance use has an impact on child. But another key piece with this is when we talk about family is it also includes siblings, older siblings. So older siblings are actually a more powerful predictor of younger sibling use than parental use, which is amazing to me. So really important for us to consider, right? If that's going on, again, perhaps we don't have our ability to impact siblings within, for example, our prevention programs, but that's when we can start building out more protective factors within those younger siblings. Thinking about those prevention strategies. All right, next risk factor within the family domain is family management problems. I like using the acronym Guidelines, Monitoring, and Consequences, GMC. So we want to have guidelines within our family of behavior, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable behavior, and it's really clear to kids of what's acceptable and what's not. There needs to be monitoring of those guidelines. You can't just have guidelines and not monitor them, because then those guidelines are basically not helpful at all, right? And then you need to have consequences, consistent consequences, and not excessively harsh consequences. When we get to the excessively harsh consequences, that's moving into the child abuse area. And so if you're looking where child abuse fits into this list of risk factors, it falls under family management problems. So in a family with parenting and looking at parenting strategies, teaching parenting strategies to parenting skills, ensuring that there's a way to gosh, my mouth just stopped working. Let me try this again. So thinking about teaching family management skills within parenting education, for example, it's important to touch on how to create guidelines within your family, how to monitor them consistently, and how to have appropriate consequences. And I should say within consequences, it's also celebrations. So positive and negative consequences that you want to celebrate when the guidelines were followed and you monitored that those guidelines were followed. So all three, guidelines, monitoring, and consequences, need to be there. Now I have to say, as a parent, that's easier said than done. I don't know about you other parents out there, but I know there are times that, as in my parenting, my boys are 18 and 21 now. There were times like with consequences, it's not supposed to be excessively harsh consequences. There are times that I'm just like, and you're going to be grounded for 6 months, and I'm like, okay, wait, take it back several notches. Like, okay, so I know these things are easier said than done, but striving for your best is definitely the most important piece here. Okay. Family conflict is the second to last risk factor in the family domain. I don't know of any family that doesn't have some level of conflict, but we're talking about excessive conflict either between the parents or the caregivers, or between the parents and children. So, and if you're looking for where domestic violence falls within this list of risk factors, it falls within the family conflict risk factor. Last risk factor in the family domain is favorable parental attitudes towards drug use. This is when parents have the attitude of kids will be kids. I did it when I was young. I'm just fine. They're going to do it anyway, so they might as well do it at home. We know when parents have those attitudes, there is more use. So it definitely increases that likelihood of use. All right. Pop quiz number 3. Get ready to go. True or false? Divorce is an example of a risk factor in the family domain. True or false? All right, about 10 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and share those results. All right, so I was a little mean. This is a trick question. Because did you hear me say that divorce was a risk factor in any of that last discussion? No, that's because divorce is not a risk factor in and of itself. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But I know divorce is one of the ACEs, and I know a lot of people follow ACEs. I would not translate ACEs. ACEs are not equivalent to risk factors. So I will talk a little bit more about divorce, but divorce is not a research-based risk factor that increases the likelihood. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. All right. School domain, just a couple risk factors in this one. So real quickly, not too quickly, want to make sure we understand, but there are some important points with academic failure. This is another thing that I see often not addressed correctly within our prevention community and our prevention work. There's some key important informations with risk factor, this being a risk factor for a kid, that it becomes a risk factor when, you'll see in those bullet points, that a child is falling behind for any reason in grades 4th to 6th or later. And the key with the 4th to 6th grade is that the label of failure gets stuck on them, essentially, that they themselves, they feel like a failure. So by the time they hit that 4th or 6th grade, if they are not doing well academically, that changes their perception of who they are and whether or not they can succeed academically. Before grade 4, there's time to recover. There's time to unstick that label that they might be feeling. So I want to see in the chat, when would it be an ideal time to address the risk factor of academic failure? When should we, if we were going to put a prevention program in place to address academic failure, when would that timing be ideally? All right, I'm seeing K to 3, 3rd grade, 2nd grade, all the time, early childhood. All right, I think many of you have the point. It's prior to grade 4. If we wait until grade 4, that's when it's gotten stuck already. So if we address it before that, then that's when we reduce the prevalence of that risk factor and the likelihood that that will have an impact on a child. So when I see prevention programs being implemented within communities to address academic failure in high school, for example, not that we don't want kids to succeed in high school, but if we are looking at it to be a substance misuse prevention program, we've waited too long if we're implementing that in high school. Now, again, not that we don't want to help kids in high school, but if our goal is to reduce substance misuse, remember we have 4% of the federal drug demand reduction budget. Ideally, we would be doing it under prior to grade 4. All right, lack of commitment to school is the other risk factor in the school domain. With this one, it is when kids, for example, they don't have a goal towards academia. They're just like, yeah, that's not important to me. That's not a big deal. And we see an inverse relationship between time spent on school activities and drug use. So the more time spent on school activities, the less drug use. The less time spent on school activities, the more drug use. So that commitment to school is very important. And I want to share a story about my youngest son. And I know the Protective Factors webinar, I forgot to get a permission prior, although I did get permission post before we posted the recording. But I did check to make sure that it was okay to share this story. So in high school, he was not academically focused. It was like, I could care less. I'm doing these classes, really not engaged in the academia at all. However, he was very engaged in tennis. And I know I mentioned that in the Protective Factors training as well. And this tennis involvement is what kept him committed to school. It kept him committed to having his grades be acceptable so he could continue to participate in tennis. And it got him there every day because if he wasn't there, he couldn't play tennis. So again, thinking about that inverse relationship, his commitment to school was increased because he had that the activities, in this case tennis, that kept him involved at school. So ensuring there's that commitment one way or another, and it could be clubs, it could be chess club, it could be theater, it could be music, it can be, it could be actual academic classes, in terms of teachers that they're really engaged with to get that commitment to school. That's the important piece. All right, and let me see jump into the Q&A really fast. Let's see if there's anything right that I can answer quickly. And the one question of could Chris comment on if the studies that Hawkins and Catalan reviewed included representative sample of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color? They did include that in many of the studies that if you look back at them, whether or not I could do more, could do better, absolutely. But they did make sure that there was representation across different cultural groups. A few years ago, a study on drug use stated Native Americans were more susceptible to drug addiction. Is that accurate? I would look back to the risk factors. So within a community, what are the level and prevalence of risk factors and how many risk factors are prevalent within the community. So regardless of the cultural community, and that could be race, ethnicity, it could be LGBTQ, it can be rural versus urban, etc. You're going to want to look at how many risk factors are present within that community. The greater the number, the more susceptible, the more likelihood. The difference between risk factors and ACEs or childhood trauma, I would say from the perspective that I am presenting today, there are different sets of studies looking at different, how do I say this really succinctly? I better not jump into this because it's going to be a big detour. I will try to write that up for you and send that in the follow-up email. Otherwise, I think it's going to take up too much time. What are some examples of some programs or strategies to address academic failure? I'm going to tell you in a bit how to find those resources. Commitment to school, equivalent to commitment to local community in some way. That it's a little different. So that's specific to the academic community is that commitment to school. So, and I'm not assuming commitment to online activities not as effective. I do not know about that. I have not seen studies about that. So it's whether or not that commitment can really be created virtually. I'm not sure about that. How do you explain high performing school with low commitment to school survey results? I don't know. That's a good question. Not sure about that. All right. With that, guess what? Last your pop quiz number 4. An ideal time to address the risk factor of academic failure is, and in the context of substance misuse prevention, I should say. Ten more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and share the results. All right, an ideal time to address the risk factor of academic failure if you're working on substance misuse prevention is grade 3 or earlier. 66% of you got that. All of the above, if remember, that label of failure gets stuck once they hit 4th through 6th grade. So the impact of that risk factor starts at grade 4. So if we're going to not have the impact of that risk factor, we need to start it before grade 4, which is the grade 3 or earlier. So great job, 66% of you got that. Let's go ahead and stop sharing. And let's move on to the last domain. All right, and check my timing, how we're doing. We're doing well. Okay. All right, first risk factor in this domain is early and persistent antisocial behavior. You'll see on the screen how I divide it up into the two. So the early antisocial behavior, this is specific to boys. In this case, research was done with boys and girls, but they found that this was occurring within boys in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And these are the boys that are very shy and withdrawn and then explode in anger. They're the ones that have the different antisocial behaviors that can occur that can create problems with them being, for example, in the classroom, within peer groups, etc. So that's the early piece. And then the persistent piece is both for boys and girls. They found it was impactful in both boys and girls. And these are things like truancy, shoplifting, fighting, etc. So those types of antisocial behaviors. All right, next is alienation and rebelliousness. These are the youth that don't feel connected to the community, to society. They value nonconformity. They don't see a place for themselves in society. So they don't feel that connection at all. So when we're talking about that question around their commitment to community, these would be the opposite, that they don't feel that commitment at all. So this is the alienation and rebelliousness piece. Gang involvement, I'm sure this is no surprise to any of you, but more like those who are involved in gangs are more likely to use alcohol and other drugs and to engage in delinquent or violent behavior if involved with gangs. So sure that's no surprise to you. Peers who use. So I said that there was one risk factor that was more likely or that can have an impact, whereas the other risk factors, just one alone, likely would not have an impact. This is the one risk factor. If a youth has a friend who's using, so alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, misusing prescriptions, vaping, inhalants, etc., they will be much more likely to be misusing substances. So this is the one case where there can be the one risk factor within a child's life and it can have an impact. Now, the likelihood of just this one risk factor being in place is, I'm not saying this in the right order, but there's likely if a child is hanging around or youth is hanging around other friends who are using, it's likely that other things are going on as well. There could be other risk factors of alienation and rebelliousness, lack of commitment to school, maybe their parental attitudes towards are favorable towards drug use, etc. So other things can be going on likely that will also have an impact on this. However, and I'll tell another story about my other son. Got permission from him. He had a friend through like 4th, 5th grade through middle school. And I could see things were going on with him. Started questioning if he was starting to use drugs in some way. And so I had lots of discussions with my son around this. I was like, because I knew this one risk factor could have an impact. It was in my brain. So I was like, okay, how do I create the protective factors? How do I know what's going on? And so I stayed on top of that relationship. I made sure there was monitoring whenever they were together, et cetera, et cetera. And he ended up being this boy, this boy ended up in treatment in high school, which luckily, great treatment. He's doing fantastic now. He's in college now. But my son was the only person in this boy's friend group that didn't use. So the importance of all the other things going on in a kid's life so that they are not impacted by friends who use is so crucial. But knowing and staying on top of it, if you're a parent and you knowing who the friends are and what they're doing, so important. All right, favorable attitudes toward drug use. We're closing in on towards the end of these risk factors. Important thing to think about. When we have a behavior change, and this is at any age, if we have a behavior change, it's preceded typically by an attitude change. We need to have an attitude towards that behavior that we think it's a favorable behavior. So when thinking about substance misuse, if you go to an elementary school and ask a group of elementary kids, what do you think about doing drugs? Typically you'll get, ooh, gross, I would never do that, it's awful, I would, yeah, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of attitude that's often present. And we often, of course, don't see the behavior of substance misuse within elementary age kids. But you ask that same group of kids when they get to middle school, what do you think about doing drugs? And you might get some more mixed results of, well, I would never do it, but I know so and so did it, and he's okay. And so, so it starts becoming this ambivalent. And then you go to high school, and then you're like, no big deal, nobody gets hurt. Yeah. So as you see that favorable attitude developing, you're going to see an increase in the actual behavior. So we want to keep the ooh, yuck, gross as long as we can. Keep the it's not for me, it's going to be harmful. If I do it, it's going to have a negative impact on me. We want to keep those attitudes as much as we can. Early initiation of drug use. Important ages here. They found in research that those who drink before age 15 compared to after age 19 are more than twice as likely to misuse drugs. So I'll say that one more time. Those who drink before the age of 15 compared to after 19 are more than twice as likely to misuse drugs. So first of all, what do you think the sheep represent on this slide? Kind of a random thing to put on, right? Put in the chat, why do I put these sheep on here? just see if it made sense. Followers, but there's actually, it has to do with the numbers. Yeah, okay, I'm glad I checked because it was because of the 2. So the twice as likely is what I meant to do. So yeah, I think I should switch to a different picture for another time. But so if they wait so those who drink before age 15 compared to after 19 are twice as likely to misuse drugs. So that was the 2 sheep. Next and last but not least, constitutional factors. Constitutional factors are the biological, physiological things within our own bodies that can have an impact, that can increase the likelihood of substance misuse. So these are things like brain trauma, fetal alcohol syndrome, actual accidents, low basal rate. It can also be things like ADHD. There are different things that are within our bodies that can increase the likelihood. And I have some more details in the participant handout on that. So again, when you're thinking about prevention, though, and our role in prevention and what kind of strategies we can implement, in many cases, we can't change the biological, physiological, our physiological selves, right? So what kind of things could we do in this case? I'd love to see in the chat. What could we do as a preventionist, a prevention professional, to address the risk factor of constitutional factors? What do you think? What could we do to address this risk factor? So I've seen look at family history. So in terms of like fetal alcohol syndrome, looking at preventing fetal alcohol syndrome in terms of what's being done prenatally. See, early diagnosis and treatment. Not quite getting to what I'm looking at. There we go, Victoria. That's what I was looking for. Increased protective factors. So if we know a child has these biological, physiological factors, we can work on increasing those protective factors so we can buffer the impact of the risk factor. Great job. And I see some other folks said similar kinds of things. Nice job. Whoops. Sorry, I was trying to scroll down the chat and I scrolled down the slides. All right. So that is the last risk factor in that list. So one last pop quiz. The risk factor that is the strongest predictor of youth substance use is which one? About 10 more seconds. All right. Let's go ahead and share the results. Well done. 63% of you said friends who use drugs. So this is the one risk factor that just that risk factor in a child's life can increase the likelihood of substance misuse. Not that the others can't impact them, but usually it takes more than one risk factor for the others to actually have that impact of increase in the likelihood. All right, let's go ahead and stop sharing. And I'm going to take a quick look at the Q&A, see if there's anything I could answer real quickly here. The workbook does not include depressive symptoms, which is not in all the surveys. Please address this. I'm not quite sure what you're asking on that. So if you could maybe add a little bit more information of what you're asking with that. Would you please, Chad says, would you please share any resources, articles, studies on the significance of peers who use? I'll put that in the follow-up email, okay? I'll pull out that information. And also about legalization, decriminalization. I'm not sure I have that handy. I do know we have a webinar in June on cannabis with Jason Kilmer. That be sure to watch that. Be sure to join in on that because he has great information about the research around legalization. And can I talk about depressive symptoms? I'm not going to go into that now because we don't have time for that. So I unfortunately cannot cover that right now. Depressive symptoms have been added to all of the surveys. sorry, I'm still not quite understanding that, but unfortunately I can't cover depression at this time in this webinar. All right, let's go ahead and want to be sure to talk about things that have been shown to not be a risk factor. All right, so we're switching gears. So we're looking at a few things that research has been done, and it's shown that these are not risk factors for substance misuse. All right, so I'm going to talk about 3 of these. One of them is boredom. I very often hear communities talk about, well, if kids just had something to do, they wouldn't use drugs. They're bored. We need to give them something to do. We just have to keep them busy. The boredom in and of itself is not the risk factor. The challenge is that if they're bored and they have those other risk factors prevalent within their community, within their environment, then yes, they're going to be more likely to use substances. But so if they're bored and they have friends who use, they have low commitment to school, they have family management problems, they have favorable attitudes towards drug use, then yes, that's going to increase the likelihood. But if they don't have those risk factors and they're bored, maybe they can go, they might be productive, right? Or they might go read a book. They might go build a fort. They might, depending on the age. So boredom in and of itself is not a risk factor. Risk factor, divorce is also not a risk factor, as I talked about a little bit earlier. So divorce in and of itself is not a risk factor. In some cases, for example, if there's a partnership or caregivers have a high level of conflict, that family conflict, and after the divorce that decreases that conflict, that actually the divorce can actually help in terms of reducing a risk factor for substance misuse. So it depends on what else is going on within that relationship, the other risk factors that are present or not, that has the impact in terms of divorce. So divorce, not alone, is a risk factor. Low self-esteem. This is something else that it crops up over and over again within prevention, the prevention community of people talking about we need to increase, increase self-esteem, kids to feel good about themselves. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, right? We want that for our kids. But if we are wanting to prevent substance misuse, raising self-esteem is not the way to do it. Programs that have been designed to raise self-esteem did not show a preventive effect for substance misuse. So they might have other positive things, but if we're looking at preventing substance misuse, programs to increase self-esteem, don't do it. If you talk to folks who work in the treatment settings or do research within treatment, people going into treatment can often have very high self-esteem, or I shouldn't say going into treatment. People who are misusing drugs can often have very high self-esteem. So that's not a relationship in terms of impacting the self-esteem and impacting or preventing substance misuse. All right, and this brings us to our post-test quiz. So please only complete this if you did the pre-test. So if you did the pre-test at the beginning, not the pop quizzes that I did, but the pre-test, if you did these same 4 questions, please take some time to complete them now to see how well I did in presenting this information to you all. And be sure to scroll down. So Taria, there should be a bar on the right-hand side where you can pull it down to get to the other questions. And I love that some of you are feeling like you didn't have any right, but now you've got them right. This is great. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and complete this question. So Rebecca, let's keep this pull up. I'm going to go through a few slides as people are finishing this up. Then I'm going to come back to this to go over the correct answers. All right, so few things. So as I've given you all this information, I know I've dumped a lot. That's why I want to make sure you had a participant workbook so you can refer back to it over time. But we need to think about how we're going to put this information into action. So with that, and actually I'm seeing people, it looks like we're pretty much done. No, people are still, I was going to say whether or not to switch back to the post test, but let's give people a few more minutes on that. All right, take action. So just a reminder, what we want to be doing, we want to be reducing risk factors in our community, and we want to be increasing our protective factors. That's how we're going to have maximum effectiveness. So just a reminder that that's where our focus will be. For those of you who use the strategic prevention framework within your for your program planning within your coalition and our prevention program, where do risk factors fit in there? They fit in many places. We want to, in our assessment, we want to be sure to collect data on risk and protective factors so we can determine in the planning step what priority risk and protective factors we need to address within our community. We're going to, during implementation, we're going to be working on reducing those risk factors, increasing protective factors. And in our evaluation, we want to assess whether or not we have truly reduced risk factors as well as increased protective factors. So through most of that, most of the SPIF, we will be working on risk factors. Reminder, as Kevin talked about in the opening video on risk factors, we want to be sure to do implement programs across the developmental stages and at appropriate times. So like that risk factor of academic failure beginning in elementary school, we want to do that prior to K through 3, prior to grade 4 in K through 3 or earlier. Early antisocial behavior, we're looking at boys kindergarten through 3rd grade, so we want to address that then or earlier. So again, address at the appropriate developmental stage. We want to make sure we have comprehensive efforts. We alone in our own prevention programs may not be able to do it all, but we can partner with others to address multiple risk factors with multiple strategies while increasing protective factors. So within a community, if you implement one program to reduce one risk factor, unfortunately, it probably won't have a significant impact, especially as you're looking at your overall community substance misuse rate. But if you can start creating these comprehensive efforts across your community, that's when you're going to start seeing some impact. I know there was a question around what strategies can we implement. I highly recommend downloading this document from the, I believe it's the Pacific Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center. It has great information on online registries that you can go, and many of them you can select by risk factor what programs, strategies, activities have been shown to be effective at reducing that risk factor. So highly recommend downloading this document. And before we get into that, Rebecca, can you go ahead and post the results of our post test? And again, in your participant workbook, there is a link to that document. All right, let's go through these. So it has in here, if you scroll down, you can see the correct answer for each one. So the first one, 78% of you, well done, nicely done. So which of the following is a risk factor for youth substance abuse? Remember, boredom is not a risk factor for substance misuse. Low self-esteem is not a risk factor for substance misuse. Divorce is not a risk factor for substance misuse. So none of those are risk factors for substance misuse. Next one, true or false, risk factors are causally related to substance use or misuse. The correct answer is false. So it's not that if this is in a child's life, they will use drugs. No, it's increasing the likelihood. All right, number 3, the constitutional risk factor includes The correct answer is the physical, biological, and physical, biological, and physiological factors that increase likelihood of substance misuse. 57% of you got that right. Well done. True or false? In this last one, identifying the priority substance misuse problem in a community provides the necessary information to determine prevention strategies. Oh, I tricked you on this one. It's false. Why is this false? So if you determine the priority substance misuse problem, like vaping, underage drinking, binge drinking, that doesn't give you the information of what prevention strategies need to be implemented. In order to know what you need to implement, you need to know the priority risk factors so that you can reduce those priority risk factors. Remember, risk factors, it was what gives you the map, gives you the information to drive you to which strategies you need to implement. That's why this information is so important, is because if you find out that vaping in this example, vaping by high school students is prevalent within your community, just knowing that information doesn't tell you what strategies should be implemented. What's important is finding out, is it the favorable attitudes that kids have towards vaping? Is it the retail availability, the social availability? Is it the parental attitudes? By finding out that information behind what's going on, that will give you the information of what strategies to implement. So sorry, I tricked you on that one, right? Okay. And I see one thumbs up. Am I clear on that now? Because I want to make sure that's understood before we log off. Give me a thumbs up if that's clear. And I see somebody crying. Did I make you sad? All right. Seeing lots of thumbs up. Okay, great. Okay, we can go ahead and stop sharing now. And oh yes, so the answer is false. Yes. I was like, oh wait, which way did I ask that? Yes, the answer is false on that one. All right. So possible next steps. How can you put this information into action? Now, as you're leaving here, I love that you all are here, but what are you going to do to put this information into action? On page 226 in your workbook, there are these different options that I have listed. I would love for you to put in your workbook, identify what you would like to do within the next 24 hours to put this information into action. That's the only way you're going to retain it. Not only way, but that will be much more likely that you will retain it. And I would love for you, there's a link in there. If you wouldn't mind, I would love for you to click over and tell me what you would like to do within the next 24 hours. You can do this after we're done here if you like, because I know we're running out of time. So go ahead and put in that Google form what you would like to do. And if you want me to follow up with you, you can put your name and email address in there. And that's optional though. All right, few last things before we wrap up. There are some webinars coming up that I thought you all, if you're interested in risk factors, might be interested in. One is we're going to talk about sustainability and how that is important within each and how you can do that for each step of the SPIF. Coming up January 25th. Our deep dive into prevention ethics series continues in February. You can join that at any time. Drug trends we're going to do on February 15th. Prevention works and a call to action, March 20th. This is that military one I mentioned before, is on April 11th. And last but not least, media literacy. We watched that Truth Initiative video. What do we do about that information's out there? We can teach media literacy. So I'd encourage you, if that interests you, to join in on that. If you haven't already, I would love it if you could follow us on Facebook and or LinkedIn. This is the way that we get information out every day to you on what's coming up and the new resources that we find out about. This is how we can get that information to you right away. And before you close out and move on to something else, I would love it if you would take a few minutes to complete our evaluation form. I read every comment that's written on there, so please know that it's worth your time to write it in there. And this is important information that we are required to give to our funding agency, to SAMHSA, so we can continue to offer these events. So with that, I know there's some questions that I didn't get a chance to answer, so I will put those in writing and we'll email those to you. And thank you so much to Rebecca and Jen, who are on the back end with me, providing all the support and answering many, many of your questions. So thank you to you both. And thank you to everyone else for participating in this webinar. It was great to have you here. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.